The first secret is always the most dangerous. Imagine a woman whose smile could disarm the most guarded men, whose hands could heal or kill, and whose mind carried a darkness older than the houses she walked through. Richmond, Virginia, 1847. The streets echoed with the quiet shuffle of men who thought themselves powerful, yet powerless to the currents beneath their own lives. A widow named Ruth Holloway had learned what every man of privilege feared, that desire could be a trap, and trust could be a tomb. You've heard whispers about women who married for wealth, for status, for security. But Ruth Holloway was not like them. She didn't need society's applause, she needed control. And she would take it in the most intimate, most final way imaginable. 8 husbands, 8 lives ended under her quiet command. The villagers around her were no fools, but fear has a louder voice than law, and superstition a sharper edge than reason. One by one, men vanished from Richmond's elite, their deaths neatly explained, their legacies untouched, but their fates forever hidden beneath the polite smiles of the widow, who knew how to bury a man alive without leaving a trace. Her arrival in Virginia was unremarkable to most. A woman seeking a new beginning after tragedy. But every detail was calculated. The precise shade of her eyes, the subtle sway of her posture, the soft knowledge of herbs that seemed to promise life but could deliver death. She carried a leather-bound journal, so innocuous, so domestic, that no one suspected it contained the knowledge to end a man's life slowly, invisibly, and legally. She walked into the lives of the city's most prominent men and watched as greed, lust, and vanity did the work for her. In their world, appearances were law. The men trusted what they could see and dismissed what they could not. That blindness would be her ally. Tonight I will take you inside her world. Not the world seen by polite eyes, but the one hidden in basements, behind locked doors, in whispers of slaves and servants, who observed what the law could not punish. What you will hear is not just a story of murder. It is a story of power, of manipulation, of a mind that understood human nature with surgical precision. If you've ever wondered how a single individual could bend an entire community to her will, this is the moment to pay attention. Because once you see Ruth Holloway at work, once you understand the elegance of her cruelty, you can never unsee it. Ruth Holloway arrived in Richmond in the autumn of 1782, though the year would hardly matter to the kind of history she was about to write. She was 28, with hair the color of winter copper and eyes that could freeze a man's doubts before he even knew he had them. She claimed widowhood, a tragedy, a story designed to pierce the hearts of men who prided themselves on chivalry and honor. But behind that widow's veil was something far more potent, a mind trained in observation, manipulation, and the quiet art of death. Her story was simple, believable, and yet intentionally incomplete. A fallen continental officer, a war lost, a fortune disappeared, a life reduced to survival in a prosperous new state. Every gesture she made, every word she spoke was a calculation. She spoke Latin, quoted literature, treated minor illnesses with remedies that seemed miraculous. To the Richmond elite, she appeared not just educated, but rare, a jewel refined and fragile, yet with the knowledge and confidence to navigate the complex social webs of the city. But Ruth's refinement was a mask, her skill at healing merely a rehearsal. She had spent weeks in Philadelphia, learning from a disgraced physician whose experiments with plant extracts had ended careers, scandal, and lives. He had discovered what nature could do to a man when combined with knowledge, patience, and secrecy. Ruth didn't just study these formulas, she improved them, tailoring poisons that mimicked illness so perfectly that doctors would swear their diagnoses were correct. Fever, stomach pain, sudden collapse, her hands orchestrated it all, leaving no trace, no suspicion, just grief neatly packaged for the society that trusted her. Within months, she had embedded herself in the heart of Richmond society. Gentlemen of influence, men who counted wealth and power as their only gods, began seeking her attention. They were drawn not just by beauty or charm, but by the subtle mastery she wielded, the art of making a man feel that pursuing her was both desire and duty. Each courtship, each marriage, was a carefully plotted move on a chessboard where she controlled every piece. These men would not merely fall in love, they would fall into her hands, and from there their fates were sealed. Even the servants, those silent observers of household rhythms, sensed the anomaly in Ruth Holloway. Whispers traveled in the dark corners, in kitchens and behind shuttered windows. But fear held their tongues. The law would not listen to slaves, and the gentry would not heed insinuation against a woman of her charm and apparent virtue. She had learned the first rule of power. Influence is most effective when unchallenged, and terror often works best when invisible. Tonight, we begin the slow unveiling of her method. Each death, each marriage, each seemingly accidental demise was not chance. It was design. And if you think this is simply a story of a killer widow, think again. This is a story of domination, of manipulation, of a mind so precise it transformed grief, fear, and lust into tools of control. Ruth Holloway did not merely kill, she orchestrated the social world around her, bending it to a dark geometry only she understood. The first man to fall was Colonel Edmund Fairfax, a robust figure among Richmond's elite. 45, wealthy, confident, accustomed to command, but he would learn far too late that power could be seduced, then extinguished. Their marriage lasted barely 6 months. Yet in that brief span, Ruth Holloway demonstrated a mastery of timing, psychology, and cruelty that would define her dark legacy. It began innocuously. Fairfax was struck by her intelligence, her calm in conversation, the way she navigated topics of politics and medicine with ease. He trusted her, welcomed her into his home, admired her as any man might admire a rare jewel. But trust in Ruth's hands was a weapon. She did not need to threaten him. She only needed to appear indispensable. And when she offered remedies for minor ailments, he accepted them without question. It was the perfect cover. One humid August night, Fairfax awoke with a sudden, severe pain in his stomach. Ruth appeared as any devoted wife might, concerned, soothing, composed. She prepared a tea, claiming it was a family remedy, a secret passed down through generations. He drank, trusting, unaware that the concoction had been engineered to mimic illness before delivering death. Within minutes, the pain intensified. Fairfax doubled over, convulsed, and collapsed. Ruth stood by, observing, calm as a predator watching its prey falter. The household was unaware of what had truly occurred. Servants heard groans, saw movements behind closed doors, but could not act. Fear silenced them. By dawn, Ruth performed the final act of her deception, the appearance of grief. She fainted at the bedside, called for doctors, and wept inconsolably. To any outsider, it was tragedy. To those who saw more closely, it was triumph cloaked in sorrow. Dr. Harrison, summoned to examine Fairfax, found no evidence of foul play. He diagnosed acute gastric fever, a common affliction, plausible, untraceable. Ruth Holloway had learned to make death appear natural, even inevitable, and she executed it with the precision of a surgeon. This first act was not merely murder. It was a lesson in dominance, an exhibition of her understanding of human nature. She knew the men she targeted were driven by pride, ambition, and desire. She used those traits against them, creating a web where their own trust and vanity became instruments of their demise. Fairfax left her wealth, property, and influence, her first tangible rewards, proof that patience, cunning, and secrecy could yield power far beyond mere survival. Tonight, understand this, Ruth Holloway was not simply a killer. She was a strategist, a manipulator of men and circumstance, turning intimacy into an instrument of control, and Fairfax was only the beginning. As we descend further, we will witness how a widow's mind, sharp as any blade, could dismantle the very foundations of a society that believed itself untouchable. After Colonel Fairfax's death, Ruth Holloway wasted no time. The widow's mourning was brief, almost performative, just enough to maintain the appearance of vulnerability while her mind plotted the next move. Captain William Randolph, a shipping magnate whose fortunes were forged on wartime contracts, became her next target. Unlike Fairfax, Randolph had survived storms at sea, battles of supply, and the fickle tempers of merchants. But he had never encountered a force like Ruth Holloway. She courted him with the same careful precision that had felled Fairfax. Each gesture, each word was a study in human desire. She appeared helpless, yet brilliant, grieving, yet charming, a paradox that fascinated men whose lives had always been guided by reason and commerce. Randolph's friends saw only devotion. His enemies, if any, saw nothing. Ruth Holloway thrived in invisibility, her power magnified precisely because it was unnoticed. She had learned that fear, when hidden, is far more effective than force. Within 8 months of their marriage, Randolph exhibited the same mysterious symptoms: sudden stomach pain, weakness, fever. Ruth offered the same remedy, a tea prepared with herbs that seemed ordinary, medicinal, even comforting. But the truth lay in the precision of her alchemy. Each formula, each combination, was designed not to kill immediately, but to mimic illness, to twist the body into surrender while leaving no trace. Randolph convulsed, groaned, and died as if fate had decided, while Ruth Holloway's eyes remained calm, almost clinical. Betraying nothing of the storm she had orchestrated, the household again became a stage. Servants whispered, noting the uncanny similarity to Fairfax's demise, but fear kept their tongues tied. Outside observers were deceived: another sudden death, another grieving widow. No one questioned the pattern because patterns are dangerous to see. They invite suspicion, and suspicion could destroy the delicate social veneer that Ruth Holloway relied upon. In the shadows, she collected not just wealth and property, but knowledge. Each death refined her understanding of men, of fear, of the fragility of life when placed in the hands of someone who knew its secrets. This was no random act. Ruth Holloway was building a rhythm, a symphony of influence over Richmond's elite. She had discovered a terrifying truth. A single individual, armed with cunning, patience, and forbidden knowledge, could manipulate society's strongest men like pawns on a board. And yet, she was only halfway through her orchestration. The story does not linger on pity, grief, or outrage. It moves forward, deeper into obsession, greed, and the dark art of control. Halfway through this descent, consider this: if you were invisible, if your every move could shape lives and fates, would you act with restraint or precision? I want you to lock this thought in. Comment the phrase, "I see the unseen," twice below. It is a symbolic key, a mark of awareness, and a signal to your own mind that you are witnessing truths most men will never confront. Ruth Holloway understood that power is never just in action, it is in perception. Every household she entered had its own network of eyes and ears, servants, slaves, maids, and butlers who noticed the smallest irregularities. To them, Ruth's behavior was puzzling, sometimes terrifying, but they could do nothing. Their fear became her shield. Silence, she knew, is more potent than defense. And terror, when unseen, can bend reality to the wielder's will. Jupiter, a house servant in Fairfax's home, had watched the first death unfold with a horror he could not speak aloud. He saw the precision of her movements, the calm deliberation behind the widow's mourning. Each convulsion, each groan of the dying man, was a step in a choreography only Ruth understood. If Jupiter spoke, he risked more than punishment. He risked the ire of a society that did not value his testimony, that treated his observations as superstition. And Ruth Holloway had learned this truth as keenly as she had learned to blend herbs into death. She weaponized their fear, allowing them to see glimpses but never the full picture. A hand trembled while arranging a teacup, a shadow lingered too long by a doorway. Each subtle signal reinforced the unspoken rule: obey, watch, survive. The servants became complicit, their silence a form of tribute, their observation a tool she could shape. She did not merely hide her actions. She constructed an ecosystem where fear itself guarded her secrets. This manipulation extended beyond households. Neighbors noted strange illnesses, whispered of unlucky widows and mysterious deaths, but no one dared confront her. Reputation and superstition intertwined to form a wall she could never breach openly. Even doctors, trained in reason and logic, found themselves powerless. Acute gastric fever, bilious fever, sudden collapse. Ruth's victims died as if by natural causes. The invisible hand she wielded extended into the very institutions meant to contain crime. By the time Randolph had succumbed, Ruth Holloway's mastery was undeniable. She had created an invisible empire of influence, one where knowledge, fear, and manipulation were the true currency. Men died, women admired her, communities whispered and feared her. Every death reinforced her power, every observation she controlled strengthened her position. She had discovered a fundamental law. To manipulate society, it is not enough to act. One must orchestrate the perception of inevitability, make the world believe that the outcome was written by fate itself. Tonight, consider this carefully. Power is often silent. Influence is invisible. And fear is the most precise weapon of all. Ruth Holloway did not merely kill. She reshaped the very social structure around her, bending loyalty, silence, and observation to her will. She was a conductor, and Richmond's elite played the symphony she composed. Note by trembling. Note. By now, Ruth Holloway's reputation as a widow of grace and intellect was cemented, but the truth beneath her exterior was far darker. She did not marry blindly. She selected her victims with surgical precision. Each man carried a secret, a weakness, a shadow of guilt that she could exploit. Some had profited from war, others had betrayed alliances, and a few had committed acts so vile they could not escape their own conscience. She had discovered the most effective way to manipulate men. Leverage their hidden sins and pair them with trust. The perfect storm of vulnerability. Captain William Randolph, like Colonel Fairfax before him, had been a survivor in business and battle. But Ruth understood that every man is mortal not only in body, but in ego. She preyed on pride, on desire to appear honorable, on the belief that knowledge and status could shield them from fate. Her courtship was calculated to appeal to those qualities. Admiration for intellect, flattery of ambition, the illusion of shared understanding. Once that trust was earned, her methods became inevitable. Her killings were never reckless. She learned from each death, noting subtle weaknesses, adjusting timing and dosage, refining her recipes to mimic illness so precisely that physicians could not suspect foul play. With Randolph, she applied what she had learned from Fairfax, enhancing the speed and subtlety of his decline. The fevered nights, the convulsions, the final collapse, each symptom orchestrated to appear natural. And when the moment of death came, Ruth Holloway performed the final act with chilling composure. The widow's lament, the outward grief, the careful display of virtue. But there was more at work here than physical manipulation. Ruth was a master of psychological control, turning society itself into an unwitting accomplice. Slaves and servants observed, feared, and remained silent. Neighbors speculated, but suspicion dissolved in the weight of superstition and social deference. Doctors diagnosed, reported, and departed. The city, in essence, became her instrument. Every rumor, every whisper, every misdirected gaze worked to protect her, creating layers of invisibility around the truth. Her influence extended beyond wealth or property. It was dominion over perception itself. Ruth Holloway understood that to manipulate a man fully, one must manipulate his reality. He must see what she allows, hear what she permits, believe what she encourages. And as men fell one by one, society's complicity, born of fear and fascination, allowed her to continue unchallenged. She was no ordinary killer. She was a strategist, a maestro of death and influence. Tonight, remember this. A man's greatest weakness is often the part of himself he cannot control. Ruth Holloway understood this centuries before psychology became a science, and she exploited it with devastating precision. By the time Ruth Holloway's third husband had fallen, her dominion had grown far beyond the walls of any single house. She had learned a dangerous truth. Power does not reside in wealth or status alone. It resides in control over information, perception, and fear. Every whispered secret, every hushed observation from a servant, every rumor circulating through Richmond's elite became a tool she could manipulate to her advantage. The city itself, unknowingly, became part of her design. Ruth began to exploit the very structures that should have restrained her. Doctors, magistrates, and neighbors all trusted appearances. A woman in mourning, delicate yet composed, could plead innocence and command sympathy while executing the most precise of crimes. Even when suspicions arose, they were dismissed, rationalized, or buried beneath polite smiles and deference. Her method was not chaos, it was invisibility, a control so subtle that the world itself became an accomplice. Each husband she courted was carefully vetted. They were men who had profited from war, who had compromised integrity for gain, who carried secrets too heavy to share openly. Ruth's genius lay in identifying these vulnerabilities and weaponizing them. She never forced a man into submission. She offered him choice, allure, companionship, and the promise of understanding, then guided his decisions toward the inevitable. Their own desires became instruments of their downfall. The psychological sophistication was as terrifying as the physical. Men became trapped not only by her poisons, but by their own perception of reality. Friends and business partners trusted her, envied her, and unknowingly reinforced her influence. Rumors of minor illnesses or sudden deaths were whispered and spread like shadows in the night. But no one connected the threads. Fear, superstition, and social hierarchy converged to shield her. Every act she committed extended her power, teaching the city to fear, respect, and ignore her in equal measure. And Ruth Holloway understood a principle that remains true today. Control is most absolute when invisible. Men could be manipulated, society could be molded, and entire households could be orchestrated without the slightest overt threat. She became a master not only of death, but of perception, teaching those around her that the world they believed they controlled was already hers. Tonight, absorb this truth. Influence does not demand violence. The most profound domination comes from subtlety, from turning trust into a weapon, from bending fear into obedience. Ruth Holloway did not merely kill. She reshaped reality itself around her will, and every man who encountered her became a pawn in a silent, deadly game. With her fourth husband, the pattern became a craft perfected. By now, Ruth Holloway had transformed murder into an art form. Each movement, each gesture, each conversation executed with terrifying exactness. Her target was Richard Stanhope, a land speculator whose wealth was rivaled only by his arrogance. He had survived the chaos of post-war Virginia, navigating treachery and shifting fortunes with ease. But he had never encountered a mind like Ruth's. Courtship, for her, was no longer a performance. It was an experiment. She observed every habit, every preference, every subtle weakness, and integrated it into a strategy that made resistance impossible. Stanhope, like her previous victims, was ensnared not by force, but by desire and trust. Her attentiveness, her knowledge of herbs, her gentle guidance of his social and personal decisions created the illusion of a partnership. He believed he was in control, yet in truth, Ruth orchestrated every interaction, every step, every choice. Her methods had evolved. Poison was now coupled with timing, environmental control, and psychological manipulation. She studied each man's physical vulnerabilities, his stress points, and his fears. Small, precise doses, administered under the guise of remedy or comfort, created symptoms that mimicked disease, fatigue, or overwork. Physicians, trained only to see physical signs, recorded plausible causes. Death arrived as a natural consequence, untraceable, unquestioned. Each act reinforced her reputation, the perfect widow, unlucky in love, yet graced with remarkable composure. Stanhope's decline was subtle, almost imperceptible to those who didn't know what to look for. To servants, it seemed like illness. To neighbors, misfortune. To physicians, natural disease. Ruth moved quietly, removing evidence, guiding suspicion away, and maintaining the illusion of grief. By the time he was gone, she had already positioned herself to inherit not only his estate, but his social networks and influence. Each death expanded her reach, transforming her from a widow into a nexus of power, invisible yet absolute. What Ruth Holloway understood better than anyone around her was this: fear need not be loud, and dominance need not be overt. The greatest control is subtle, untraceable, and internalized by those who think themselves free. She created dependency, trust, and admiration simultaneously, then used them as levers to bend the world to her will. Tonight, remember this lesson: the most dangerous individuals are those who operate in silence, who manipulate perception, who convert desire into submission. Ruth Holloway was more than a killer. She was a strategist of life and death, a master of human nature, and the invisible architect of a society that believed itself untouchable. Even the most precise systems contain flaws. By the time Ruth Holloway claimed her fifth husband, there were whispers, soft, fleeting, easily dismissed. But they existed. Servants in distant households began to notice patterns: sudden illnesses, repeated fevers, an uncanny similarity to previous tragedies. They spoke in hushed tones, fearful of the consequences of observation, yet the fear itself betrayed awareness. It was the first shadow that hinted her empire of influence might not be absolute. Neighbors too began to murmur. In Richmond, society thrived on appearances, but appearances could only hold so long when multiple men in the same social circle died under circumstances that seemed too similar to be coincidental. Some gentlemen privately questioned the chain of misfortune, yet public acknowledgement was impossible. Reputation demanded silence, and superstition demanded respect. Ruth Holloway understood this perfectly. She had built her dominion upon these invisible walls, and now she faced the first tremors against them. The fifth husband, Jonathan Beckett, was cautious, worldly, experienced. Ruth's usual methods required adaptation. She observed him, noting subtle signs of resistance, moments when his pride threatened to break her illusion of control. Her psychological manipulation deepened. She deployed doubt, subtle flattery, and calculated care, reinforcing his trust while tightening the invisible chains. She had learned that not all men succumb immediately. Some required prolonged engagement, a patient erosion of resistance, a slow alignment of desire and fear. Beckett's illness began subtly: a slight weakness, an unusual fatigue, a minor stomach complaint. Ruth attended him with the same outward concern she had perfected, all while adjusting the formula, the timing, the environment. The city around them remained oblivious. Friends, colleagues, and even physicians could see nothing amiss. Yet the servants whispered. The pattern was becoming undeniable, but their fear, entrenched and cultivated by Ruth herself, ensured silence. They were witnesses bound by terror and loyalty alike. This was the lesson Ruth Holloway had taught the city. Almost unconsciously, power is maintained not just by action, but by expectation, by fear, and by the perception that those who might oppose you are powerless. Even now, as shadows of suspicion crept along Richmond's streets, she remained untouchable, because the minds around her had been trained to doubt themselves, not her. Fear had become the invisible architecture of her empire. Tonight, take note, control is rarely broken by force. It is tested by observation, whispered speculation, and the faintest glimmer of doubt. Ruth Holloway had created her perfect system, and yet the cracks were beginning to show. How one responds to those cracks determines whether dominion lasts or collapses. Ruth Holloway's genius was not confined to the act of killing. Her true mastery lay in shaping the minds of those around her. Every servant, every maid, every slave in the household she entered became an unwilling participant in her symphony of control. They saw glimpses of her methods, shadows of her intentions, but the rules of society, fear of reprisal, and superstition ensured their silence. They were trapped in a psychological prison, and Ruth held the keys. Jupiter, who had witnessed Fairfax's death, and countless others like him, were forced into an uneasy complicity. They lived each day under a quiet tension, never sure which actions might provoke observation, never sure which slips of attention might cost them their lives, or at least the wrath of a widow whose charm concealed the precision of a predator. Her influence extended beyond fear. It was the subtle reshaping of perception. In her presence, even the sharpest minds questioned reality. What seemed natural could be manufactured, and what seemed accidental was often deliberate. This terror was cumulative. A household adjusted its routines, whispered warnings, avoided actions that might disturb the widow's rhythm. The boundaries of obedience became internalized. Servants acted not out of duty, but out of the constant invisible pressure of expectation and dread. In this way, Ruth Holloway weaponized not just her victims, but everyone who could witness, influence, or report her actions. Fear became a tool, silence a shield, and observation a means of control. Even within her husbands, the psychological grip extended beyond the physical. She studied each man's fears, weaknesses, desires, and pride, weaving them into a web from which escape seemed impossible. Her remedies were not merely chemical. They were also psychological, presented as care, love, and attention. They lowered defenses, cultivated dependency, and manipulated perception. By the time the symptoms became fatal, her husbands were already entrapped in a labyrinth of trust and illusion from which there was no exit. Consider this. The most dangerous dominion is one that operates invisibly. Ruth Holloway did not shout her power. She whispered it, insinuated it. Let it grow like a shadow in the minds of those around her. She taught them that control could be absolute without confrontation, that fear could be more binding than chains, and that silence could be a fortress both for herself and her influence. Every household she entered became a microcosm of her empire, a system of observation, compliance, and terror that extended her reach far beyond the confines of her widowhood. Tonight, reflect on this. Power over perception is the most absolute power of all. Ruth Holloway wielded it not as a weapon, but as an art form, and every man, every servant, every observer became a part of that dark masterpiece. By the time Ruth Holloway selected her sixth husband, her methods had evolved into near perfection. Samuel Whitmore, a prosperous merchant known for his intellect and meticulous nature, seemed untouchable, a man of logic and skepticism. Yet even he was not immune to the widow's precision. Ruth had learned that men like Whitmore required a subtler approach. Not overt manipulation, but a carefully constructed illusion of safety, trust, and partnership. Every aspect of courtship was calculated. She observed his habits, his meals, his medical complaints, and even his minor anxieties. Ruth's knowledge of herbs and untraceable plant extracts allowed her to administer controlled doses that would appear harmless at first. Small stomach pains, fatigue, subtle nausea, symptoms that could easily be attributed to stress, diet, or overwork. But the doses were cumulative, designed to weaken body and mind while leaving no evidence of foul play. She had turned chemistry into an invisible scalpel, striking with precision only the body would feel. The psychological component was equally meticulous. Ruth nurtured dependency, establishing herself as the sole source of relief, guidance, and comfort. Whitmore's intellect, normally a shield, became a liability. He rationalized her care as benevolence, not danger. Even his observations, however logical, were filtered through the lens she shaped. Every decision he made, every sip of her tea, every night of rest in her house was aligned with her control. By the time the illness fully manifested, he trusted her implicitly, unaware that she orchestrated each moment of his decline. The household again became silent theater. Servants whispered to each other, noting the uncanny similarities to previous deaths. Fear prevented their testimony. Superstition demanded obedience. Even physicians called to observe could see only what she allowed them to see. Her brilliance lay not in brute force, but in subtlety, in bending perception to her will, in creating the illusion that the inevitable was natural. By the moment of Whitmore's death, Ruth Holloway's mastery of control over body, mind, and society was undeniable. She had refined her art into a system that left no traces, created no suspicion, and yet exercised absolute power over life itself. Each death had strengthened her understanding, each widow's veil had shielded her from scrutiny, and every silent witness had reinforced her authority. Remember this truth: domination is not always physical. Ruth Holloway's empire was built upon fear, trust, observation, and invisibility. Her genius was in making men and society alike believe that their world remained intact while she rewrote it, one life at a time. Even the most flawless system begins to crack under the weight of repetition. By the time Ruth Holloway claimed her seventh husband, the whispers were no longer isolated. Servants began exchanging stories in secret, drawing faint lines between illnesses and deaths that had once seemed unrelated. A faint unease rippled through households, a shadow of recognition that, if pursued, could expose the widow's deadly pattern. Fear remained strong, but curiosity and instinct began to prick at the edges of silence. Society, too, was starting to murmur, though no one dared speak openly. Gentlemen noticed the pattern. One widow, multiple prominent men, deaths following swiftly after marriage. Polite conversation could not contain the growing tension. Families whispered in drawing rooms, children overheard fragments of conjecture, and strangers passing through Richmond noted the strange series of misfortunes with a chill in their bones. Ruth had always relied on invisibility, but repetition was beginning to draw lines that only the careful observer could connect. Ruth understood instinctively that the first threat to her empire was awareness. She adjusted her approach. Poisoning became more precise, dosages tailored to each man's constitution, minimizing risk of suspicion. Psychological manipulation deepened. She crafted distractions, feigned concern, and amplified trust to keep doubt at bay. The widow's role became a performance of perfection, grief measured, gestures timed, interactions orchestrated to reinforce the illusion of innocence. Even those who began to see cracks were guided back into compliance through subtle intimidation and charm. Meanwhile, the household observers, slaves and servants, became both allies and instruments of control. Their fear was leveraged, their quiet observations manipulated. Ruth Holloway had learned that a vigilant eye restrained by terror could do more to secure power than any weapon. She had created a microcosm of society in each home, compliance bred from fear, obedience enforced by perception, secrets maintained by the invisible hand of authority. The lines of her influence extended into the streets of Richmond itself. This tension between emerging awareness and Ruth's meticulous control was critical. It demonstrated a key principle of dominance. Power is not absolute when repetition reveals pattern. But mastery lies in managing perception so that those who sense danger doubt themselves instead of the orchestrator. Ruth Holloway's genius was in maintaining this delicate balance, in turning fear, curiosity, and observation into tools of her invisible empire. Tonight, understand this: the most dangerous manipulators are those who adapt. Ruth Holloway did not falter in the face of suspicion. She refined her system, deepened her control, and continued to turn the world into her stage. And as the next death approached, Richmond's elite remained blind to the pattern, even as it etched itself into the shadowed corners of their lives. Her eighth husband was different. By now, Ruth Holloway had become a master of observation, manipulation, and timing. She had studied the weaknesses of 7 men before him, refining her methods, perfecting the art of death disguised as care. This last victim, Thomas Wentworth, a wealthy planter and influential figure, appeared cautious, calculating, and suspicious. But even he was not immune to the widow's design. Courtship was precise, deliberate, and psychologically exacting. Ruth studied Wentworth's routines, habits, and insecurities with meticulous attention. She presented herself as a partner who could soothe his fears, guide his decisions, and enhance his reputation. Every compliment, every tender gesture, every conversation about shared values was a calculated move to disarm him, to bend his perception so completely that he would not even question the inevitability of what was to come. By the time they married, she had already constructed the framework of his demise. Ruth's chemical methods were now flawless. The subtle doses of plant-based toxins, mixed into remedies and teas, produced symptoms that mimicked natural disease with uncanny accuracy. Physicians could only report what they observed: fatigue, fever, sudden pain, and collapse. No trace of malice existed. Yet in every measured step, Ruth maintained psychological control. She provided care, comfort, and counsel, reinforcing trust while guiding her victim ever closer to death. Her mastery lay in timing, in knowing exactly when to act, and when to allow the body to betray itself under the illusion of natural illness. Household servants, who had borne witness to 6 previous tragedies, now lived in a state of paralyzing terror. Some whispered quietly, connecting the dots in hushed tones. Others avoided observation altogether, fearing reprisal or the unknown. Ruth Holloway had transformed their fear into loyalty, their silence into protection. Each death had sharpened her understanding of human psychology and social systems, turning every observer into an invisible ally in maintaining the facade of innocence. When Wentworth finally succumbed, Ruth's precision reached its zenith. She appeared distraught, conducted the funeral with grace, and assumed control over property, wealth, and social influence as she had with every husband before. But this was not merely about inheritance. It was about absolute mastery over life, perception, and consequence. Each act, each death, each silent observer had reinforced her empire of fear. Ruth Holloway had not simply survived in a male-dominated society. She had bent it to her will, leaving behind a pattern of control so refined that even centuries later, the echoes of her strategy remain chillingly clear. Tonight, consider this. True dominion lies not in brute force but in control over perception, trust, and fear. Ruth Holloway's genius was in wielding them simultaneously, leaving men and society alike unaware of the invisible chains that bound them. Ruth Holloway's reign of calculated deaths did not end with Thomas Wentworth. Her legacy lingered long after the funerals, long after the townspeople had whispered their suspicions into the dark. The truth of her crimes was buried beneath layers of social politeness, fear, and the unquestioned authority of perception. Officials and physicians, unable to detect her methods, recorded nothing more than natural deaths. To the outside world, she remained the grieving widow, refined and respectable, a woman beyond reproach. The discovery of her deadly pattern came only decades later, when workers renovating old estates uncovered remnants of her secrets, journals, recipes and notes detailing symptoms, dosages, and the careful orchestration of each death. Rings, property deeds, and other artifacts traced her influence across Richmond's elite. It was a revelation that shocked historians and ethicists alike, exposing how one individual had manipulated entire households, communities, and institutions without ever raising suspicion. Yet even in discovery, there was a lesson about human nature. Society's complicity, whether through fear, ignorance, or deference, allowed Ruth's empire to flourish. Servants' silence, neighbors' hesitation, and the unquestioned trust of men all contributed to her near-absolute power. Her influence extended beyond her immediate victims. It became a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of systems when perception is unchallenged and fear is invisible. The psychological mastery Ruth employed resonates even now. She did not simply kill, she controlled. She leveraged desire, trust, guilt, and superstition to construct a microcosm where her will was law, her judgment absolute. Even after death, the echoes of her strategies, silence, observation, fear, and invisibility, teach us that domination need not be overt. The most dangerous force is subtle, psychological, and deeply embedded within the structures we take for granted. Her legacy is a shadow over Richmond, a reminder that influence often hides behind civility, charm, and trust. Ruth Holloway's story challenges the notion that strength belongs to the visible, the forceful, or the official. True power, she demonstrated, resides in the mind. The ability to bend perception, manipulate fear, and orchestrate reality while the world believes it remains untouched. Tonight, remember this, history rarely reveals the most dangerous figures to you openly. Often they operate in silence, in invisibility, in the spaces society refuses to scrutinize. Ruth Holloway is a lesson in both fear and strategy, a woman who reshaped the lives of men and the perception of an entire community without ever raising suspicion. Ruth Holloway's genius lay not only in killing but in concealing. Every death she orchestrated was wrapped in a veil of normalcy, reinforced by social structures and human assumptions. Doctors, constrained by the limits of 18th century medicine, could only report what they observed. Gastric fever, bilious fevers, sudden collapse. They trusted appearances, relied on their education, and never questioned the widow who appeared both grieving and competent. Ruth used this trust as a weapon, turning those meant to preserve life into unwitting instruments of her control. Servants were equally pivotal.
Fear and superstition bound them in invisible chains.
Ruth never had to command them overtly. She allowed them glimpses of her knowledge, her precision, her understanding of life and death, so that their terror did the rest. Silence became a currency, observation became a tool, and every action they took was aligned with maintaining her image. She transformed every household into a self-regulating machine of obedience, where fear and uncertainty preserved her secrecy more effectively than locks or weapons ever could. Societal norms amplified her power. Politeness, deference, and the rigid hierarchies of Richmond society ensured no man dared openly question a widow of status. Gossip was whispered and dissipated, inquiries avoided. Ruth Holloway understood the value of appearances. Grief measured, comportment perfect, social charm impeccable. The world around her interpreted her carefully choreographed behavior as virtue. In reality, it was strategy. She had weaponized expectation itself. Even her victims played a role. Trusting men, blinded by desire, ambition, or pride, became instruments of their own demise. Ruth's psychological precision ensured they acted in accordance with her plan, taking the medicine she provided, believing in her care, submitting willingly to the process she had designed. They became collaborators in their own deaths, convinced of their own agency while she orchestrated every element. The lesson here is chilling. True power is sustained not only by action, but by the orchestration of perception. Ruth Holloway manipulated systems, individuals, and social norms to such an extent that even those closest to the truth could not confront it. Fear, respect, trust, and invisibility combined into a fortress of control, one that endured beyond her immediate reach and left a pattern that would puzzle generations to come. Tonight, reflect. Mastery of influence often depends less on strength or violence and more on subtlety, psychology, and societal blindness. Ruth Holloway did not merely survive in a dangerous world, she controlled it. Ruth Holloway's actions did not end with her final husband. The echoes of her influence lingered long after the widow's veils had faded, shaping the city, its families, and its social networks in subtle but lasting ways. Richmond became a city shadowed by fear and suspicion, a place where whispered caution tempered ambition and curiosity. The silent compliance she had cultivated in households created a cultural inertia, a learned obedience to unseen rules, that persisted for decades. Families that had lost men to Ruth's careful designs inherited both wealth and trauma, though the truth was obscured. Heirs were suspicious, yet the lack of evidence forced them into silence. Social bonds shifted as trust became tentative, and whispered speculation subtly altered alliances and marriages. Entire households internalized lessons about observation, loyalty, and self-preservation, unknowingly passing them to the next generation. Fear, once a personal weapon, became a social inheritance. Historians who later uncovered her journals and the evidence of her methods were forced to confront a terrifying truth. One person had manipulated entire networks of men, servants and officials without ever being challenged. Society had, in effect, been her accomplice. The patterns she established, trust weaponized, perception controlled, fear internalized, revealed the fragility of social systems when psychological control and cunning intersected. Her legacy was less about murder than mastery, a blueprint for invisible domination that few could see and fewer could resist. Even centuries later, Ruth Holloway remains a cautionary specter. Her story demonstrates that influence is often more potent than brute force, that perception shapes reality, and that fear, properly cultivated, can bend society itself. Richmond's history, carefully archived and sanitized for polite consumption, conceals the depth of her control. Yet those who study her methods see the pattern clearly: calculated manipulation, psychological dominance, and invisibility as tools of absolute power. Tonight, Reflect on the unsettling lesson Ruth Holloway leaves behind. Influence, subtlety, and perception can surpass wealth, status, or brute strength. A single individual, armed with knowledge and strategy, can reshape lives, societies, and history itself. She did not merely survive. She orchestrated, directed, and mastered, leaving a legacy that whispers through time as a warning to those who underestimate the power of the unseen. Now, consider yourself in the presence of Ruth Holloway, not merely as an observer, but as a participant in understanding her methods. What she accomplished was not brute force. It was mastery over perception, trust, and fear. Each of us carries within the seeds of influence and vulnerability, and her story challenges you to recognize them. The question is no longer, could this happen? But rather, am I aware of the unseen forces that shape my decisions, my fears, and the lives around me? Pause for a moment and reflect. Every interaction, every whispered assumption, every unexamined habit, these are tools, weapons, or weaknesses, depending on how they are understood. Ruth Holloway's brilliance lay in her ability to see and exploit these human patterns, to bend men, servants, and society itself to her will, without overt confrontation. Now ask yourself, what patterns exist around you that you fail to perceive? What influence do you unknowingly grant to others, and where could it be weaponized against you? This is the point where engagement transforms into awakening. If you understand the gravity of what you've just witnessed, comment the phrase, "I see the unseen," twice in the comments. By repeating it, you are not merely participating in a ritual, you are locking in a shift of perception, affirming that you recognize both the forces that shape reality and your capacity to navigate them. Each repetition strengthens awareness, creating a symbolic anchor in the algorithm of attention. Much like Ruth Holloway anchored fear and obedience in her world, remember, awareness is power, and knowledge without action is weakness. Ruth Holloway manipulated trust, fear, and perception to her advantage. By consciously observing the unseen forces in your own life, you claim a fraction of that mastery for yourself. Comment the phrase, "I see the unseen," again, twice, and consider how the subtle structures of influence operate around you. Tonight, embrace this lesson. The world is rarely as it seems. Patterns, perception, and psychological currents flow beneath the surface of every decision. Ruth Holloway's story is not merely historical. It is a mirror reflecting the potential for domination, cunning, and mastery that exists in all human systems. Your task now is simple but profound. Observe, analyze, and internalize. The unseen is no longer invisible once you acknowledge it. And now, as the story of Ruth Holloway comes to its chilling close, pause and feel the weight of what you have uncovered. This was not merely a tale of murder, it was a lesson in absolute control, in bending perception, in shaping reality while the world believed itself free. Every gesture, every whispered observation, every shadow in Richmond's streets was part of a larger design. And in understanding her, you glimpse the mechanics of influence itself. Ruth Holloway reminds us that fear is more than emotion. It is currency. Trust can be wielded as a weapon, silence as armor, and appearances as the most effective camouflage. Society, constrained by convention and expectation, can become the perfect accomplice to a single, calculating mind. She taught us that mastery is invisible, power subtle, and domination psychological. The most dangerous forces are not those seen with the eye, but those orchestrating outcomes behind the curtain of perception. Consider yourself now changed. You have walked through the corridors of history where influence and manipulation ruled, where death was methodical, and where perception was the ultimate battlefield. The shadows of Ruth Holloway's empire reach beyond centuries, whispering warnings to those who believe that strength lies only in the obvious. Real strength is awareness, discernment, and the capacity to perceive patterns others overlook. Carry this truth with you. Every man you meet, every system you enter, every decision you make is influenced by forces you may not see. Knowledge is your weapon, perception your shield. Ruth Holloway's legacy endures not because she killed, but because she controlled unseen currents of thought, fear, and obedience. She was and remains a masterclass in the art of domination without force. As you step back into your world, Let this story linger, not as horror, but as instruction. The unseen is powerful, and mastery over it changes everything. Observe, anticipate, and understand. Ruth Holloway did not merely live. She ruled invisibly, and by studying her methods, you have glimpsed a level of awareness most will never achieve. Tonight, remember her lesson. Power favors those who see what others ignore, and fear is only as binding as the mind allows.